Welcome to The Explainer. So today we're diving into something that's obsessed poets, philosophers, and, well, pretty much every pop star for thousands of years: crazy, irrational love. But we're not looking at it through the lens of art today. Nope, we are putting on our lab coats and looking at it through the strict, mathematically rigorous lens of science. We're going to explore that wild intersection where seemingly unpredictable mate choice crashes right into the hardwired cognitive rules that actually run the show behind the scenes. And our guide for this journey? A tiny, incredibly noisy amphibian from the tropics. Okay, here's our roadmap. First, we'll look at the science of crazy love. Then we'll meet our star, the Tungara frog. From there, we hit the amphibian cocktail party, do a little math of attraction, meet an eavesdropping bat, and finally uncover a universal cognitive rule. Let's get into it. Section 1, the science of crazy love. The notion of crazy love is based on the premise that persons in love often do not make decisions in predictable or rational ways. Now, for the longest time, both in pop culture and even in evolutionary biology, we kind of just threw our hands up and accepted that picking a mate is just wildly unpredictable. But science is finally looking deeply at these seemingly irrational quirks in nature. And what they're finding is that what looks like absolute madness actually has a deeply ingrained structural mechanism behind it. To really get at that mechanism, we have to look through a very specific scientific lens, something called cognitive ecology. This is basically the study of how animals acquire and analyze information to make decisions in their environment. And honestly, it is the absolute perfect tool to decode the beautifully chaotic decisions involved in finding a mate. See, we're not just looking at physical traits here. We are looking way deeper at the high-level cognitive processing that fires up in the brain when an animal is evaluating a potential partner. Which brings us to Section 2. Meet the Tungara frog. So say hello to the Tungara frog. This is a really tiny guy, literally only about 30 millimeters long, hanging out in Middle and South America. But despite being so small, when a male wants to attract a female, he doesn't mess around. He produces this massive, highly specific acoustic fingerprint. That complex visual spectrogram you're seeing, that's what this little guy's mating call actually looks like when you map it out. And this gets us right to the core of their whole mating strategy. The frog's call starts off with a simple whine. Now, a whine all by itself is totally necessary, and honestly, it's sufficient to attract a mate. But if a male adds 1 to 7 short little bursts of sound right at the end, which scientists literally call chucks, making it a complex call, something incredible happens. The females exhibit a massive, 5-fold preference for these complex whine chuck calls over the simple ones. I mean, it is an overwhelming hardwired bias for complexity. Moving on to Section 3, the amphibian cocktail party. Okay, picture this for a second. It's the rainy season in the tropics. Males are out there calling in groups that can range from just half a dozen to literal hundreds of frogs. It is so incredibly loud. So here is the core problem for our female frog. In this absolute cacophony of overlapping calls, how does she accurately link a specific whine to a specific chuck from the exact same male? Because if she messes up her auditory grouping, she might walk right up to the wrong frog. Now, if this sounds familiar, it's because it maps perfectly onto a highly relatable human experience. We call it the cocktail party effect. That's the ability to focus your auditory attention on a particular stimulus while filtering out all the other background noise. If you've ever been in a crowded, noisy room trying to zero in on one single voice, you know exactly what this female Tungara frog is going through. Think about it. If our auditory processing completely failed at a cocktail party, you might accidentally combine half a sentence from the person right in front of you with half a sentence from some guy across the room. You'd end up with this bizarre, nonsensical message. Well, the frog is facing that exact same cognitive challenge. So to figure out how females actually solve this, researchers built something called a phonotaxis arena. And it's such a cool experimental setup. They took a female frog and placed her right in the center of a circle of speakers. Then they completely separated the whine and the chuck, playing them out of different speakers at different angles. And amazingly, they found that females are actually pretty error-prone. They would group a whine and a chuck together as if they came from the same male, even when the sounds were physically separated by up to 135 degrees. But interestingly, when the researchers gave them more information, like presenting one whine and 2 different chucks, the females actually got much better at grouping the sounds with the closest spatial separation. Section 4. The math of attraction. So we know females prefer more chucks over fewer chucks. But how on earth are their little amphibian brains actually calculating this? Well, there are basically 2 ways to do the math here. Absolute differences versus proportional differences. Basically, does the female just subtract the lower number of chucks from the higher number, or is she actually comparing the ratio between the two? In psychophysics, there's a well-known concept called Weber's law. It states that as a stimulus gets bitter or louder, the difference between two stimuli has to be proportionally greater for a subject to even notice it. So, which math are the frogs using? Well, researchers found their answer, and it is a whopping 84%. They discovered that absolute differences in chucks explained only 16% of the variation in female preference, but proportional differences, the ratio, that explained a staggering 84% of the variation. This is huge because it means these female frogs are strictly following Weber's law. They aren't just sitting there blindly counting, their brains are actively calculating proportional ratios to make their mating decisions.
And that brings us to Section 5, the eavesdropping bat.
Because, of course, nothing in nature happens in a vacuum, right? This next part brilliantly illustrates the absolute life and death stakes out there in the jungle. Meet the fringed-lipped bat. You see, these male frogs aren't just broadcasting their sexy, complex calls to the females, they're accidentally broadcasting them to the entire forest. And this bat? Yeah, he's definitely listening. Let's break down how this bat actually hunts. He relies almost entirely on the male's call to locate his dinner. And, just like the female frogs, the bat is totally attracted to those simple whines. But tragically for our romantic little frog, the bat also heavily prefers complex whines with chucks. I mean, it's wild. The bat even uses echolocation to evaluate visual cues, like how the frog's vocal sac inflates when it calls. It's this incredible kind of dark twist in our story. The exact same signal that makes a male frog irresistible to a mate is the exact same signal that puts a giant target on his back to get eaten. Which leads us to our final stop, Section 6, a universal cognitive rule.
So we already know the female frog uses Weber's law, that proportional math, to evaluate the male's chucks, right? Well, researchers asked a pretty brilliant question. Does the bat do the exact same thing? So they ran the exact same phonotaxis experiments, but this time on the frog-eating bats. And the result? No way. The bats also use Weber's law to judge the chucks. Literally 74% of the variance in the bat's choice was explained by the ratio. This completely proves that this mathematical evaluation is not just some quirky little adaptation for amphibian romance. It is a universal cognitive algorithm. It's a fundamental property of the vertebrate brain, shared across vastly different species that are operating in entirely different behavioral domains. One is doing it for sex, and the other is doing it for survival.
Which leaves us with a really provocative question to wrap up this explainer. Are our most complex, seemingly irrational decisions actually governed by these ancient, hardwired cognitive algorithms? I mean, when we feel that unpredictable, chaotic pull of crazy love, are our brains really just running the exact same proportional math as a tiny frog sitting in a Panamanian puddle? It's a fascinating thought, honestly, and it totally changes how we view the cognitive ecology of attraction. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this leaves you looking at your own decisions just a little bit differently today.